All right, greetings everybody. Welcome to our 12th webinar on the EZMed and Medici platform, a functionality that is sponsored by the SpecNet Global Group. My name is Colin Atkinson. I'm standing in for Lani Ace, our product manager that you will have seen regularly on the forum. And I'll be chairing this afternoon session as we go through the process. We've got lots of different specialities with us today. I think the most prominent that we've seen over the last 12 weeks is really our psychologists, sitting at about 220 in total. We've got biokinetics sitting at about 63 now, physiotherapy at 94 people joining us or practices, OT 63, optometry 34, chiros, we've got 10 chiros, welcome chiros. We've got 28 dietitians with us this afternoon. Registered counselors, 32, nice to see. Social workers, we have 14. And podiatry, we have 16 podiatrists with us as well, and a whole host of other specialities. So this is really special for us. We appreciate that you investing your time with us. It's important for me to mention that in this forum, we're sharing opinion and experience, which by no means constitutes a legal process or a legal opinion. And should that be needed, we urge you to consult with the necessary practitioners on some of the topics which you require clarity on. So today we're going to be looking at positioning your practice for growth. Essentially, when we were looking at the topic for positioning your practice for growth, we were considering building practices, but also putting your practice into a position to be saleable, should you need to get into that process, or should you choose to. And in that as well, looking at practices in rooms, in hospitals, home care, and then effectively where our interest lies heavily is invested in the telehealth space. Before I get going, just to let you know, obviously we've got the chat functionality. We encourage you to use the functionality. We will endeavor to answer as many of the questions as we can. Those that we are not able to get to on the forum will be posted on the EZMed.solutions website, where you will also be able to find all the previous webinars, links to previous webinars, and previous recordings. For your own edification. On that website as well, there will be a link to the Medici platform, which will take you through into all the information you need to know about the exciting virtual platform that we've collaborated with, which we know will provide solid solutions to your clinical needs. Okay, so really to go the form of introducing our two guests with us. I think Dion Beres, you've seen on a few occasions. Dion is a global executive at our SpecNet organization. Effectively, as we've said before, the brainchild behind the ProfNet and EZMed solutions or product offerings, and well-versed in legality, well-versed in pricing, coding, system management, and practice management as part of that process. And we've also got Neil Kingsley with us, a special collaborative friend and guest to the SpecNet organization, currently the MD of Medici in South Africa, and obviously we've enjoyed the partnership with the Medici crew, which we believe has collaborated to foster solutions and also making sure we've got great functionality in that system. So we look forward to sharing with you some of the opinions, I think, that come into that process. So Dion, for me just to kick it off, let's start right at the beginning. In terms of building a practice from scratch, what is it that you really need? What are the bare necessities? How do you set the practice up? What do you need to be considering? Because I think ultimately that's going to drive the value in the practice, and what it makes it saleable or what makes it scalable. Depending on what your preference is. So I'll hand the first one over to you, please.
Thanks, Colin. Good afternoon to you, Colin, and to you, Neil, and to all our participants. Thank you very much for joining us again on our regular Thursday 4 p.m s. The numbers have grown steadily. We've had over 700 registrations for today, and it's really an honor to have this time with you guys. We trust that we can keep it casual and conversational. We have been responding to the various questions that have come up in our Q&As as well as in the chat functionality as we've gone through the webinars. And we really are shaped week from week. Last week, one of the key things that came out as we discussed billing and how do we determine our billing policies and structures and pricing frameworks. There was many questions that came forward saying, now that I know that, what else do I need to do to actually set up my practice? And what was really interesting, Colin, is that we had these questions from people who are new students, people in community service, those who are working for practices, those in public sector considering to go into private practice. But we also got the question equally from people already established in practices to say, I know what I've done, but I just need to check this. Is there a way I can go through a checklist? Is there something I can just make sure I've ticked all the boxes? So I think I'd like to take this approach really to just say, what are some of the basics, but then also what are some of the things we can do to enhance, and we'll unpack that as we go on today. So I think just the nuts and bolts of starting up a practice in South Africa under, and I think just the disclosure here is under the Health Professions Council regulations is what I'm closest to. We know the Allied Health Professions Council's regulations are very similar to the HPCSA regulations from an ethical and framework point of view. In fact, they even reference the HPCSA ethical regulations in their own documents. So there's very strong commonality there. We also understand that some of our participants this afternoon are under the Social Work Council, others under the Nursing Council. But essentially, we're operating in a similar framework. But my departure point is from an HPCSA platform, so that's just a rider. But essentially, to run a private practice, one needs obviously to be able to bill for your services that you're rendering. So the first and most important thing is that you can only practice as a healthcare practitioner. Once you're registered with the appropriate authority, and that is our regulator, our statutory councils. So make sure you have your HPCSA, your Allied HPCSA, your SANC number, which then says that you're duly registered and qualified as a healthcare professional under the title that you're practicing. And obviously that defines your scope of practice and what you can and what you can't do. So essentially that's the first step. Make sure you're practicing ethically. And then the second step is determining in which capacity you're actually going to be setting up your practice. And I think we'll double back to this one, so I'm not going to unpack it too much. But if we do no registrations, as far as a company registration goes, Colin, you'll essentially be practicing in your own name. So you can start up a practice immediately with your HPCSA registrations in place in your own personal capacity. In other words, the identifying number or indicator of what your practice is then practicing under is your ID number. And then you're obviously wanting to bill for your services if you are going to be offering that service at a cost. And that billing of your services needs what people commonly referring to as a BHF number, a Board of Healthcare Funders number. It's a bit of a misnomer. I think that's just what we mostly call it, but it's in fact your PCNS number, your Practice Code Numbering System number, which the BHF is in fact administering at the moment. And that's your practice number that we often call it. And that's a 13-digit number. We typically use the last 7 digits in that number when we're rendering an account, but the full number is a 13-digit, which starts off with your prefix for your discipline. And that you get from the BHF, and there's a process to go through there. But once you've got that, and that number is linked to a bank account as well as you're doing your application, you now have a bank account, you have a practice number, you have your HPCSA number, you have your ID number, and off you go. You can practice. Now you're practicing as a solus practitioner, and you're then able to render services in your personal name. So that's the start of it, and that's really kicking you off. Be sure that when you're starting up your practice, there's a couple essentials you need in place. And the one that I really want to raise now is your medical malpractice insurance. There's no one regulating that. And in fact, you'll search far and wide to find regulation that insists that you must have medical malpractice insurance in place. I know in the psychology space, there's been a lot of work done at HPCSA on that and giving guidance on that. But obviously, it's highly recommended that you have medical malpractice insurance in place, and that you can typically get through your association or society or directly through some broker that does provide those services. And that is to ensure that you are covered should there be any negligence on your part in the treatments that you're providing and the patient decides to sue you. So I think that would be most certainly the first checkboxes that you have to have in place before you kick off and start treating patients.
Neil, so if you look at that framework, I think one of the considerations that doesn't really come into it in the beginning, I think until we experience the environment we're in at the moment, is really adding the telehealth component to it. I think people see it as a component that's added in the middle of a crisis, but in reality, from the beginning, bringing telehealth into your practice is really going to enhance from the beginning your reputation, we would suspect, but also the demographics that you're able to talk to. So in your opinion, what do you think the value is of telemedicine right from the beginning of getting your practice on the go?
Yeah, thanks. Afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be back on the regular Thursday afternoon. I took myself a bit of a break, but it's nice to be back. So yeah, you're 100% right. It's a lot easier to bring telemedicine into a practice right in the beginning. And I mean, we have seen over the last couple of months how telemedicine has increased the value of these practices. And I'll tell you why I say this. I mean, if you read any business book out there, the one thing, there's a golden thread that runs through most of these business books, and it's about streams of revenue. And it's very difficult, when you start to think about a practice, how would a practice create a secondary stream of revenue? And this is something that I've said many times on these webinars as well, is that one of the downfalls, I think, of a practice is that it has only one single stream of revenue. And that is a patient coming into the consulting room, seeing the provider and creating revenue in that way. Telehealth creates a second stream of revenue. And that is, instead of the patient coming to the provider, telehealth is taking the provider into the realm of the patient. I mean, it's taking them to their home or their office or wherever that internet connection is. It's a completely different, it's reinventing that provider-patient relationship. It's making the patient the center of that healthcare delivery model. That means you get the level of satisfaction increases. You have a far more loyal patient, and you have a second revenue stream. So we've watched practices over the last couple of months who have successfully implemented telemedicine and created that second stream of revenue. I would argue as well that a practice, the valuation of a practice at some point or other, I would argue that a digitally engaged patient base would be highly desirable. Because all that hard work of getting those patients into that digitally engaged platform has been done, creating that second revenue stream. So telemedicine plays a great part in the valuation of a practice today, and we've watched this over the last couple of months as well. I mean, there's also the other point that in some practices where you have 3, 4, 5 providers, telehealth is instrumental in providing continuum of care. And where you have that platform that has already been established, I mean, it just makes that platform that practice, just a far more desirable practice, I think. And that's been borne out, I think, here and around the world.
Yeah, I
understood.
think
so if you're taking, Dion, if you're taking that formation now, where we're obviously building on blocks here at the moment. We've got the basics of the practice in place. We bring in telehealth. We're assuming we're creating value inside of our practice. You mentioned registered in your personal name and your personal ID, but now you want to put that into a business structure. Essentially, there's some pitfalls there that you've got to be very careful of around PTYs and not allowed, and so don't you want to give us some insight into putting another block onto onto actually driving growth inside of your own practice?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I think this is such a fundamental conversation, and very often this conversation is had almost when it's too late. We have many practices that come to us and say, I've had a good innings, I've had my practice for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I'm wanting to retire, I'm wanting to emigrate, and I'm wanting to sell my practice. Can you assist me in evaluating the practice? And then what are the steps as far as actually doing the sale of the practice? The sad thing is, and I can relate a story that was communicated to me by a dentist, a prominent private practicing dentist in Johannesburg. And he was saying it was so sad to see that there was a dentist he really looked up in the area. He built a phenomenal base of loyal patients. He was very well known and respected by his colleagues, and he had a great patient book that consulted to his practice. But then he retired and he wanted to sell his practice, and he could hardly get anything for the practice. And this dentist was telling me what a shame that is. He's done so much. He's built his practice over so many years. And now that he's trying to sell it, he's not getting much value for it. And it's that lesson that I want to bring right to the start. And we often do talks about preparing your practice for sale. And the question is, and I do the preparing your practice for sale to students, to final year medical students and healthcare practitioner students. And immediately response is, well, why are you telling us how to sell a practice? We haven't even started a practice yet. But I think that's the kicker of it. When should you start preparing your practice for sale? And I think if you're going to start preparing your practice for sale when you're hitting the 64-year mark of age, or if you're going to start saying, listen, I might want to emigrate or sell my practice for whatever reason, it's too late. We need to be starting that right from the start. So from the day you're opening your practice, you should be asking yourself, if and when one day I'm selling my practice, what would it look like? What should I do now that's going to add value and strength to the actual sales process when I get to that point? Unless, of course, you want to just open your practice, run your practice, and at the end of your innings, ready, sell your equipment, close your doors, and call it a day. And there are practices that want that simplicity, and I'm not speaking a judgment on that. I think you need to determine what your outcomes are. As long as your expectation isn't at the end of the innings, you're going to get some kind of remuneration or reward for the asset that you've built, but you haven't actually spent time building the asset. You've been running a practice and really working hand to mouth, or running as a solus practitioner. And that speaks to the structure or the framework that you do that. Now, many healthcare providers, Colin, look for advice from their accountants or from lawyers in their practices or running their books, and they're saying, listen, I want to get serious. I want to build up a company, or I want to create a more formal structure, or I want to manage the risk to me as an individual by setting up a company so that there's risk to the company, but not to me and my family and my home and those kind of things. I want to protect my assets. The first thing an accountant or lawyer will typically do is say, well, consider a company. But the accountant or lawyer needs to have a proper understanding of our regulatory framework within the healthcare space. And our regulatory framework states that we may not run through a PDY limited, a CC, or a trust when providing healthcare services, clinical services. Now, we might ask the question, but why is that? Is that just being obstructive, or what's the reasoning behind that? And really, the crux comes down to the fact that us as healthcare providers must maintain personal liability for the services we offer. Remember, I said before in the start that we need medical malpractice insurance. And that's really so that if a patient wants to seek recourse against you for failing to deliver clinical services or putting them at risk or causing material damage or harm to them, then that patient wants to come after you. And what you can't do at that point is hide behind a corporate veil. That's the HPCSA wording. You can't go and say, don't sue me, sue the company, or don't sue me, sue my employer. You can't hide behind that corporate veil. You have to take personal liability for the services that you offer and the risks that go with that. And so you'll notice in the Companies Act, there's a change of what is typically known as an incorporated company. It's been changed to what we call a personal liabilities company, and that explains exactly what it is. You maintain personal liability. So if you are wanting to set up a company type of structure for your practice, and I'll declare my bias up front here, I'm a huge proponent for incorporated companies, setting up an Inc. for your practice for many reasons, and I'm happy to unpack that in detail if time allows. But essentially, that's the closest you're going to get to a corporate structure for your practice, Colin. So, and what you're doing here is you're actually then removing your ID number, and you are registering an Inc. at the Registrar of Companies through the CIPC process. They will issue you with a company number. Now, what's also very important for our delegates, for the participants today, those of you who think you haven't got an Inc., please go and check the following. Those of you who've got a company, please check the following, and that is, what's the last two numbers in your company number? It will typically be the year you registered, 2020, / a whole lot of numbers, and then / and it's either going to say 07 or it's going to say 21. If it says 07, it means it's been registered as a PDY limited, and that's in contravention of the HPCSA regulation in running a clinical practice. It needs to have a / 21 at the end, and that'll mean you duly and correctly registered in an incorporated company. And that really is, I think, almost two extremes. You've got the solus practice and you've got the Inc. And that's the continuum from running a practice that you want to close at the end of your innings or try and sell it. And there's a special word that goes with that sale usually. And Colin, is one you raised in preparation is Goodwill, and we can unpack that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got your incorporated company, which is a formal company with its own number. And the beauty about the Inc. is that your bank account is in the name of the Inc. Your lease agreement signed with your landlord is in the name of the Inc. Your staff that are employed by the Inc. And the list goes on. Your EZMed or your practice management system is licensed to the Inc. Your Medici license is licensed to the Inc. So everything's attached to the Inc. So if I sell my shares in that incorporated practice, I pass those on to you, Colin. You become the new shareholder, or I sell it 50-50 to you and Neil. You're now 50-50 partners in the practice. I can now move away. I've now sold my shares, but you buying the entity, which is still contracted and linked to all those. So you can see there's a running concern there. And everything is continuing as it contractually did before. Even your VAT numbers, your tax numbers, your bank accounts, all of that's there. On the flip side, you've got a solus practice. And I sell that.
So Dion, can I just, sorry for interrupting you midstream there. I think we've probably hit a bit of a nerve here. Just looking at the chat functionality, we've got, I think Brenda Bosch has just requested, if we can just put those numbers up again, just the two, I think the tail end numbers just indicating PDYs.
Sure.
Maybe you just want to repeat that for the benefit, I think, of all the delegates who might be concerned. Yeah.
So go and have a look at your company number, your registration number. You typically see it on a CIPC certificate, a Registrar of Company certificate. If it finishes in /21, you're good. That's an incorporated practice. If it finishes in 07, it's a PDY limited. And again, I want to stress, in a PDY limited 07 number at the end, you may not provide clinical services through that. Now, I'm emphasizing clinical because you can provide other services which could possibly form part of the second part of the conversation. But your clinical services may not be rendered through that. You may also not employ clinical staff in a PDY, but you can employ them in an Inc. But remember, your non-clinical staff, like maybe a receptionist, administrator, cleaner, security, you can employ in either the Inc. or the PDY limited. Yeah?
Okay.
Any other questions there, Colin, or shall we talk a little?
No, I think that was probably the most pertinent one. I think which we needed just to pause on, just to make sure we get in the platform. And then before I rudely interrupted you in the middle of that,
no problem.
Middle of that thought process. So.
No, please do. I think just to round it off, and I just want to juxtapose again that an incorporated company can be most certainly something you can almost tiptoe away from. You can sell some of your shares, all of your shares. And you can move away from that practice, and it can, in fact, still be called Burrs Physiotherapist Incorporated. And if I give written permission for you guys to continue under that name, you can continue. And so you can build brand awareness and a market awareness, a loyalty to that name. And I can retire, immigrate, die. It can be two generations on from here, and it's still called that, but it's got different owners. And I'll talk in a minute about those owners. And so that continues. A solus practice, on the other hand, you've got to do quite a careful task of tiptoeing away from it. But when you tiptoe away from the practice and you're trying to leave it for somebody else, realize that as you tiptoe, you're pulling all these strings along with you. The bank account, the practice number, the employment contracts, all of that must be re-signed in the name of the new owner, because me as a solus practice can't leave anything behind. It's my ID number, it's me. So I take that all with me, and I try and leave something behind for the purchaser. And I also have to convince that purchaser to pay good money for something I'm leaving behind. But as I leave, I'm taking a lot of that with me and recontracting all of it. The new landlord, the landlord could say, sorry, the new tenant, I'm not going to actually sign that with you. My contract was with the previous tenant. And then what have you got? You don't even have a place to practice from, and you bought this practice. So be careful when buying that. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about,
So in terms of that component and buying into that type of a practice, I think we've got, again, I think it's a point that needs to be elaborated or maybe clarified. So Wenzel Kutz has asked us the question, saying that he believes telehealth consulting is not permanent, and that the opinion is really that it will stop post-COVID-19. So I think this is for me, it's a fundamental question that I think inside of our organizations have debated, and we've consulted at an HPCSA level, and we've had Dr. Quinder on the forum as well to try and provide as much clarity as possible in that process. Is essentially when you're building a practice for growth, it is in our opinion that you do actually bring on telehealth from the beginning. So it might be incontrovertible to some opinion that it's going to stop post-COVID-19, but maybe Neil and you want to come in here and just share some thoughts. I mean, you've got direct access into the United States at the moment where the DCHU was birthed, and you work regularly with the executive team who's looking at the stats and the practices in that environment. What is your view? What's going on probably in one of the biggest hotbeds in countries at the moment in the US, and the view around telehealth?
In fact, I saw the question come up, and I was also going to bring it up as well, because it's probably the question that comes up the most often around telemedicine. First of all, it assumes that telemedicine only started in COVID, that it was temporary. That's not the case at all. Telemedicine, and I've said this before, has been around for years and years and years. Informal structure where proper providers were using WhatsApp and telephone and email, etc. That's telemedicine. That is the remote care with your patient. But even our platform, we have been around for 3.5 years in South Africa, long before COVID started. So telemedicine has been around for a while already. I think, I don't know, I suspect people are not entirely aware of how big telemedicine is at the moment. Not forget the world. In South Africa. I'll give you some idea just now, but I have come across doctors that have given up 2 days they don't use their rooms for 2 days of the week, and they're only doing virtual consultations. So 3 days of the week they're in their rooms, 2 days they're doing virtual consultations. That's the kind of thing that's happening right now. There's a lot of providers that are doing that. So telehealth has been extremely successful, not only now, but certainly over the COVID crisis and over lockdown, to extend care. We've said this before, it's going to be very hard to put the genie back into the bottle. I think the efficiencies of telemedicine, the efficiencies for both the doctor, the efficiencies for the patient has been realized. We do expect some changes, after COVID, whenever that might be. I think that's absolutely going to happen. We're very involved. As you know, we are involved with the Digital Healthcare Association. We're very involved in lobbying for changes around the regulations. And I absolutely do not believe that telemedicine is going to stop at the end of COVID. Not at all. In actual fact, we should have seen a reduction in consultations as lockdown eased. We haven't seen, in fact, we've seen the complete opposite.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's going to give maybe Wenzel and maybe a few others some certainty at least on opinion. Dion, you've got something that you wanted to bring into the mix.
Yeah, Wenzel, that's a critical question, and we were asking ourselves that same question when we said to ourselves, we're going to take EZMed, we want to enhance that into telehealth, but is this just the solution for the next few weeks? Some of us were even thinking back in March. For the next few months, do we put that kind of weight of development behind it to find a quick fix solution that is not long lasting? We did make the call to say we back this, and I'm very pleased that we have, because as Neil says, it would be difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. We posed this question, and I do encourage you to go and listen to the webinars that we had Dr. Quinda on. It's recorded. All our past webinars are recorded. Just go to EZMed.solutions. And please go and listen to those. Dr. Quinda, who's the acting CEO registrar of the HPCSA and the ombudsman for the HPCSA, has made it clear that the HPCSA is not looking at just resetting the button back to pre-COVID in the position that they had on telemedicine. They called it at that point, and are calling it telehealth, but that in fact they will reapply their minds. They will reconsider, they will look at the behavior of practitioners, they will consult with various role players, and they do understand that telehealth goes a long way to deliver accessible and affordable healthcare, and that it has a role to play. He also admitted that the HPCSA needs to look at embracing digital technologies to enable and empower healthcare. So that obviously has to go through its processes at the board and so on. But when you've got the acting registrar, CEO, and ombudsman showing a great intention to engage and to apply their minds to not saying, let's go back to how we enacted this in 1974, but let's look at what 2020 looks like. And that's quite encouraging. So my personal view, it definitely is not going to go back to how it was before, but we have to handle telehealth responsibly. We must make sure we're not superseding other practitioners. We must make sure we're not overbilling or over-servicing or using telemedicine in an inappropriate place where we would not have actually provided healthcare in the first place, just because we're trying to swim our way out of this COVID crisis. So as long as we're using it responsibly, I believe the regulators will support it going forward.
Yeah, you're 100% right there, Dion, and that's. I think that's the general consensus that anybody that's in the in the industry has at the moment. And as I've said, the efficiencies that we've seen that have come out of telemedicine, not only for the patient but for the doctor, have been immense. And there's some really, really interesting studies that are coming out as well that I think are going to back us up. I was reading, I think it was last week I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine. There was the Oregon State University had put just over 900 patients into telemedicine. And they had found that over a 12-month period, and obviously putting them into contact with specialists, etc., 46% of these patients had saved something like $4 million just in travel costs. I mean, those are the kind of efficiencies that are flowing through. And now, when you take that to the next step, as we all know, as you get towards the end of the year, medical savings accounts start to run out. And we know, and there have been a whole bunch of studies on this as well, people tend to start to forego care when their medical savings accounts are starting to run out. They tend not to get that care very often. Telemedicine has been the obvious solution to that. I'll tell you where there's another one, and this is such a great one. And I'm going to write a book on this one day. I'm telling you I'm going to, because just to list the providers that I've come across in the last couple of months and how they've used telemedicine to just completely change their practice. But I came across a provider out on the coast about two weeks ago. And she was telling me that one of her biggest frustrations was no-shows, cancellations. And I ended up writing an article. I was asked to write an article for somebody about 2 weeks ago, and I wrote an article exactly on this. And my thinking around this was that you need to figure out why are patients no-shows in the first place. And her frustration was that, where you have a patient who's a non-show, doesn't pitch up for the appointment, first of all, it costs her money. There's an administrative process, there's a booking schedule, there's all those sort of things. And then the patient rebooks again, there's further cost to her. It completely disrupts the clinical workflow in her practice. And, if you look at, I came up with 6 reasons, I thought, why patients probably are no-shows. First of all, they either forget, they're busy, they're working moms, they're professionals. It could be inconvenient. Now we know, and this happens, this happens. The patient will phone a provider to get an appointment, and it's at an inconvenient time. So they phone another provider, get a better appointment, and forget to cancel the first one. We know that happens. So it's inconvenient. Accessibility often happens, and that it's just too much of a hassle to get there. We know of patients that don't go because there's a roadblock or the traffic is hectic, etc. Her point was that since she has embraced telemedicine in her practice, no-shows are no longer a problem. Because you've eliminated all of those problems. You've eliminated the accessibility problem. And she is an EZMed user. So she's scheduling through EZMed. Those reminders are going through to her patients. And that is a place that I don't think a lot of us thought about in terms of the efficiency of telemedicine. Just removing that chronic problem of no-shows.
Yeah. Neil, I'd like to maybe add into that while we're using examples, because we've had a tremendous experience over the last, let's say since April, on telehealth and how we've integrated that into our systems. And we have our latest addition to the EZMed family is a audiologist who's 74 years old. And she has, so I just want to dispel that thinking where people are often saying, telemedicine is digital, it's technology. Firstly, my old patients won't be able to embrace it. I can give you personal experience where they have embraced it better than some younger patients. And I'm too old to learn, or I don't want to change my processes. Here we have a 74-year-old audiologist who's using telehealth and telemedicine in a very impactful and effective way in managing. She has got a specific niche within audiology that enables her to do it that way. So I want to dispel that myth. And then there's also some questions here. Saying, but telemedicine is really great for practitioners who don't need to use their hands, they're not using hands-on techniques. And I've been very encouraged, and I can name them again. I think Megan's on the line, but we have practitioners that are in podiatry, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, who are physical practitioners, if we can call it that, rather than your consulting disciplines like psychology, dietitians, and so on. And they have found ways to enable and empower their practice and extend their practice, even though they're physical disciplines, to follow up with patients, see how they're getting on, even tell them, listen, from what I've heard from you, you don't need to come in for that follow-up. That patient management process is not going to replace our face-to-face, but it's an additional tool and a channel to actually reach out and to manage our patients, which is really exciting. So don't block yourself by thinking within that box of I'm a physical discipline and I can't do anything outside of that. Embrace this technology and see what's appropriate for your patient care. And then
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there is this perception that you can really only use telemedicine in those disciplines where you don't need to see the patient all the time. I mean, I've given you so many examples where I've used I use telemedicine with my physio, my bio, granted. Exactly.
Your own stitches out through telemedicine.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. That's right. Yes. And in fact, I mean, I don't know if Megan is on, but I'm going to use her as an example just now because it relates to that. I'll use that just now. But there's this perception that, you can only use telemedicine in those disciplines where you don't need to be seeing. And that's not true. There are those follow-up interventions, etc. And that just frees you up. And that's the point of telemedicine. It frees you up to be able to spend the time with those patients that you do need to be seeing physically and still extend care to those patients that you can see on a remote basis. I see Jonathan has just actually posted a point there. He's actually just endorsed what we've just said. He's had 0 no-shows on telemedicine. I mean, there's another point about no-shows as well, and it was brought up by somebody else, and I do agree with it, and that is you tend to find that established patients tend to be less no-shows because there's a stronger relationship over there. And look, it has been shown time and time again that telemedicine is a very, very strong tool to create that strong relationship between doctor and patient. And I don't know if you remember, it might have been our 2nd or 3rd webinar, and we were on the webinar, and it was just before we were about to close, and my doctor used Medici to come back to me and said, "Hey, Neil, how's your foot?" Do you remember that?
Yep,
and I was like, that is amazing.
That's it.
Now, I mean, what was that? 2 months ago? And I'm still like, that is amazing. You know,
what is that relationship with that doctor? I mean, it's really
that relationship between provider and patient is just grows stronger. And it took him 3 seconds out of his day.
Now I know Colin's going to want to bring us back on point and talk, but I want to add one more thing if I can.
Can I just, Dee, before you get going there, I just want to let you know that Megan has actually confirmed, Neil, that she is on the call. So
hello, Megan.
Good.
Saying hi, So,
good.
Dion, you wanted to make a final point, and then I really want to bring us back to the inherent value of a practice, and I want to start talking about the topic of goodwill and the perception that goodwill is saleable, and what is goodwill.
Sure.
So maybe, Dion, if you could work straight into that, would be great.
Thank you. It's a brief one, and I see it's in the questions as we're going along and chatting. And somebody's asking the question, can you charge for telehealth consultations? So I really do want to encourage everyone who's on the call that haven't seen the previous webinars. There's 12 of them in the bank already. Please go back and watch those videos. There's some incredible stuff, and a lot of the questions we're getting, we've gone through. We're more than happy to repeat those and knit them together from different angles. But the answer is yes, we did a full webinar on that. We've even explained at that point which medical aids are and are not paying for telehealth consultations. So there is codes in some disciplines. There are specific codes that you must use. Make sure your practice management system has got those codes loaded for you at the rate for that medical scheme, that plan for that patient. I know a great system that does that for you, but make sure your system does it and that it's there and available for you. There are other schemes that will say, we don't have a specific code for it. Use your usual consultation codes. But some disciplines, they'll pay 100% of your rate, whether it was face-to-face or telehealth. Other medical schemes will pay you 75% of your rate. But it's still the same code, the consultation code that you would have used before. So there's no new codes. So it's adding more complexity to our billing systems and pricing, but with the right practice management system that works done for you. It's uploaded immediately. All you have to do is say, this is telehealth. I'm in this discipline, it knows it already. This patient, it knows it's what medical scheme they're on, and here's the rate that if you are charging medical aid rate, that's what the rate is. So please look for the right billing system, practice management system, and ask for a demo of EZMed before you make your decision, please. We'll help you with that.
Dion, can I just, while you're trying to sell the EZMed system, which might be perceived as being biased, to be honest. Don't you want to get into Goodwill for me? And
sure.
I think there's a lot of questions coming up around Goodwill. What is Goodwill? And really, you know, how do I build value in my practice, and what does it mean, rand and cents wise, what I'm building and what I've achieved in years and years of consulting?
Sure. You know. So Goodwill is an interesting one. In my view, so firstly, maybe let's start with a core definition of goodwill. If you're going to go and search for the definition and you're going to look for it in accounting terms, there's a very clear definition of what goodwill is. And this is the scary part. Goodwill is the difference between the inert value of this bottle of water, what it really is worth, versus the price I'm asking for it. There's a difference. And that difference is accounted as goodwill, because the accountant is going, hang on a second, in our books, we got this bottle worth R1. But you say you want to buy it, you want to sell it for R3. So what am I supposed to do? The books don't balance. And then they say, well, let's put the word goodwill in for R2 so that 1 + 2 is 3. And this side says I'm selling for 3. So now it's balanced. But can you see by that definition alone, goodwill is stating that it is the difference between the real value of something and what you actually want to charge for it. So you're wanting to charge more for something than the value it's worth. Now, when you're reaching for goodwill, Colin, if you're looking for that word and you're depending on that word, it means you haven't prepared your practice for sale, in my view, because you've prepared it by accident and it's come to the value of R1, but you want more for it. Now, what are you supposed to do to actually make up that other R2 so that you're not dependent on the word Goodwill to justify for some reason that you can't put your finger on why you want more for something than what it's worth? Okay, and that's how you prepare your practice for sale. And those are processes like putting it in the right format and structure, like an incorporated company. I believe that gives you a tremendous leg up on being able to quantify the value of your business, and that there's value to the business after you leave, because you're leaving something behind. You're not just leaving a vacuum behind for somebody else to try and fill. So things like your policies and procedures. Is your practice accredited? Are there accreditation programs you can go through which will add tangible value to your practice? Have you got a robust financial statements? Have you got the last 5 years audited financial statements? I think it's also important that people often say, you want me to register as an Inc., but that's a company. That means I must be audited. That means there's a whole lot of other tax ramifications. You've got to apply your mind to that, but know that in the updated Companies Act, you do not have to be audited as an Inc. There are some criteria, and trust me, most practices, if not all, don't meet those criteria of having to have to be audited. But should you be audited? I say yes, because it contributes value to when you're selling your practice to say, I have 5 years audited results. Here they are. This is the value of the practice over this time. This is how it's grown. This is our profitability. You've got a solid set of financials that you can actually use to quantify the value of that practice. And that, again, adds value to that practice and builds it up. Are you working in a multidisciplinary team or interdisciplinary team structure? That adds stability to your practice. What does your referral networks look like? That adds stability to your practice. Sure. I think it's just about making sure that you are able to put objective elements on the table, saying this is my practice and this is what it's worth and this is what I wanted to sell it for. People do also add into this things like patient files. And I just want to refer people back to the previous conversation we had with the HPCSA on this in one of the previous webinars, where we were speaking about patient files. And just be careful. Very often we say, there's my cabinet. I've got 10,000 patient files in there. That's why I'm asking you 100,000 Rand or R1 million for Goodwill, because you get the patient files. Here's the key. Be careful. Whose information is that? Do the patients, have they consented that you pass the clinical information on from you to somebody else? Now, if it was an incorporated company, those patient files belong to the Inc. So when I sell my shares, there's somebody else who owns the shares of the incorporated company. Can you see how it's all done at a distance, and you actually got a quantifiable asset that you're selling rather than a vacuum after you leave as a solo practitioner, which you then have to put the tag of Goodwill in to try and justify the reason of why you want to sell it for the price you're selling it for. Colin, does that answer the question, or are there some other?
It answers the question. So essentially, you're saying in realistic terms, the audited process is really critical.
Absolutely.
I think from discussions we've had, Goodwill doesn't carry much goodwill, to be honest, in terms of value. It really, and I think in a common terminology that we use in the offices that we've moved, it's like selling vaporware, really, or ether. It really has no value at all. So. But then you've got to say to yourself, if a practitioner or one of the folk that are attending the webinar today is considering adding telehealth to their practice, ultimately that's got to come down to really an audited process where it's adding value, because that's why else would a practitioner want to build in a system into their practitioner which really doesn't add value? So I suppose the question is back at Neil is to say, in your view, adding telehealth, not just as a necessity during a COVID period, but during a process of normal practice, do you see it having an influence on the value of the practice and what that really means? And how can it be credited?
Yeah, Colin. So we have seen over the last couple of months, and since we've been operating here and in the US, those providers that bring telehealth into their practice start to change the demographic of their patient base at the same time. Somebody, I think it's Jackie, put an interesting point on, and that was, isn't telehealth more beneficial for those in the rural areas where access to care would be a little bit more of a challenge? Yes, absolutely. But by the same token, it is just as convenient for myself, who sits in the middle of Bryanston. So the efficiencies and the convenience are for both of us. But generally you will find that a patient base is generally in a certain area close to the practice. I mean, if that wasn't the case, my mother wouldn't have a practice in Benoni and in Johannesburg. I mean, my lawyer doesn't have a practice in Johannesburg and Benoni, nor does my accountant, but yet, you know, providers do, because they tend to be closer to the patient base, and that's intuitive. What you find with telehealth is that you're able to extend care to patients that are not in that closer vicinity. I'll use the example right now. Megan, who's on the call, I ended up having a conversation with her the other day, which ended up in a consultation, and she assisted me. I actually have no idea where she's based, but she assisted me. And here's an interesting thing. I will now, I mean, she got a patient out of me. I will become a patient of hers. She doesn't know, now she knows. But, you know, so using telehealth has actually brought a new patient into her practice, one. She gave me some advice that you know, told me where to go, what I needed to do, and I'm going to have to do that. And I mean, she could have been in Cape Town, to be honest. So we do find that the geographic and the demographic of that patient base actually changes. There was an interesting study that was done by Johns Hopkins towards the beginning of the year. They were looking at how telemedicine could be used in extending care and managing elderly patients, especially elderly patients that were not compliant in terms of their practice regime and so on. And telemedicine was found to be extremely efficient in managing those elderly patients and also keeping contact with their caregivers. So these are opportunities for a practice to incorporate telemedicine into their practice and extend care to patients that they ordinarily may not have. And that we've seen, you know. There is a lot of talk right now about, in fact, I think it came up, a question that may have been last week or the week before. I have a patient who has immigrated to Australia. I want to continue looking after that patient. How do I do that? So these are a lot of these conversations that are happening right now. It's not just patients that are defined to a certain geographic area anymore.
I want to confirm just on the ethics side of that, and I'm quoting again from one of our previous webinars, is that if you're registered as a healthcare practitioner in both the region or the country you're consulting from, as well as the country that the patient is in, Australia, Cape Canaveral, wherever it might be that the patient finds himself, if you're registered in both regions, you can do telehealth consultations to them as per the HPCSA regulation. So I think that's valuable, as well as the allied HPCSA. I can confirm it's there as well.
We also, I think as well, Neil, some of the, just in terms of the consulting practice and consultations, there was an opinion as well, and which probably incorrectly so, was based around having to prepay for telehealth consultations in that process. So maybe you want to shed some clarity on that perception of whether a prepayment is really viable.
Look, I've never come across prepayment in virtual care. I mean, well, there's certainly an ethical issue around it, and certainly an HPCSA issue around it. I've never come across prepayments in any way. I think that the perception might come from the fact that you do have telehealth solutions that show a rate. So, you know, any provider will say, well, my rate might be 200 Rand, for example. I mean, in my book, that is transparency. And this also comes back to, you know, patient retention. Because if you look at I mean, a practice wants to keep their patients just as much as they want to bring in new patients. And one of the things that we found where patients don't stay in a practice is lack of price transparency. That's the opposite in telemedicine. You know exactly what the consultation is going to cost, but I've never come across, certainly not in South Africa and in the US, I've never come across a payment that's been, or a virtual consultation that's paid for upfront.
Again, Colin, I just want to tag in the ethics here, is that we must make it clear that you may not, under the current regulation, both at the HPCSA, as well as the fact that we're on a fee-for-service basis, is that it's fee-for-service that's been rendered, not fee-for-service that might be rendered. And you may not charge upfront for services not yet rendered. You may not do that. So that's an ethical contravention. So we must make that clear as well.
So I suppose we're getting to the back end, I think, of the hour. There's possibly about 10 minutes to go. So I really want to just I want to wrap for the audience really the journey that we followed so far. So we've really spoken about starting basically how to register the practice, how to take it from your independent name into an Inc. and a process which I think is is regulatory approved. We've then looked at, I think in that process, the different pillars. Do you bring in telehealth in the beginning? Do you wait for a crisis? How do you build value in that practice? We've looked at Goodwill. Really, as we've said, it really is meaningless in terms of adding value to your practice. And I suppose we need to get to the point of the real value in the practice. Can you add to it? Can you add the loyalty of the patients to your practice through a telehealth platform that, you know, and can you prove that when you're looking to sell that practice on? You know, I've got a telehealth component to that, and I'm consulting 500 patients a year through that platform. You know, therefore, I've got a bigger demographic than normal practice would have. Is there viability in that statement, Neil? In terms of your thinking?
I absolutely think so. I think that because of the fact that a practice has integrated telemedicine into their practice, and they're able to extend care sometimes on a far more frequent basis, that patient loyalty, and we know that patient satisfaction is heightened. I mean, around that, you know, we've seen surveys of patient bases where 50% of a patient base will say that they're quite happy to pay a greater consultation rate over weekends or after hours. I mean, that's the great opportunity for telemedicine. And if you have got an engaged patient base in a practice where that is creating that second channel of revenue, I mean, that's just it's a fantastic opportunity for a practice to embrace. So absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
I'm starting to sound like the regulator himself, but I just want to raise the ethics around that again. So what is really important is that if you are going to establish regular weekend work, that becomes your new working hours. It's your working hours as chosen to do. So you can't be charging additional percentages or fees for after hours modifier codes. If everyone can just please keep attent to that. It is where it's outside of your normal working hours. If you decide you work Saturdays doing telehealth, that's your new normal working hours. So it must be outside your working hours, and it must be an emergency. So those both must be complied with. So just be careful about that one, yeah.
So I suppose that speaks into Dion, a critical component. You know, obviously understanding you're stressing the ethical component to it. So is there various structures you can run your clinical practice in that we can maybe give some guidelines to the audience in your opinion?
Thank you.
Just various structures.
Yeah, thank you. So we've spoken about the solus sole prop or solus practitioner status element on the one end of the spectrum, and the inks on the other end of the spectrum. There's two in between that the HPCSA will allow you to practice for your practice. The one is a partnership, and I'll quote, it's not my quote, it's my accountant's quote. But it says, a partnership is a sinking ship. Please stay away from it. We can unpack and spend an hour telling you why not to do it, and very few minutes to say why you should do it. It is really not a good idea from a liabilities and risk point of view. And if anybody is in a partnership, I'd encourage you to rethink how you do that and to consider one of the other structures. And then the fourth one is an association. Now, association isn't a structure itself. It is more association agreement on how your solus practices and other solus practices, or solus practice and an Inc., or partners and solus practices can work together in association with each other. And that is an association agreement defining that relationship. And typically what that will do is it'll allow you to share common expenses. So it makes it cheaper to run your practice, like sharing a receptionist, or sharing CPD activities, or sharing a waiting area. So that's what associations typically do, is gear the sharing of expenses, but your income still remains the various parties within that association. It remains their own business, their own bank accounts, and their own processes. So that's an association. So there's only 4 ways you can run a clinical practice: solus practice, partnership, association, and Inc. That's it. The others you can use to manage these practices, or do what we call management companies or utility companies, to employ non-clinical staff and even do your billing and so on at an arm's length. But they cannot be rendering clinical services from those entities.
Okay, so we've, I think that's extremely valuable information, Dion. I've got 5 minutes, and you guys tend to talk a lot, so I've got to make sure I can regulate opinion. I think, Neil, you know, we've seen a lot of functionality being added to the Medici application, specifically in the US. Maybe you want to give the audience some. We're trying to set the platform for a practice, different components for a practice, legalities around it. Where are you seeing telehealth and specifically the platform progressing to? What are the components that are being added that are really going to provide real value for the folk on the call today on a day-to-day basis? Where are you seeing that go?
So, I mean, we spend all our time figuring out benefits and features that are going to make the life of the provider better. So ease of use, but we have to balance ease of use and data security at the same time. So, we will often get a provider that will say, I'd love to see this benefit. We could probably make it, but we don't want to do it at the cost of security. And I've said this many times before, your data security is part of your patient care. So, but we're on a path at the moment to try and make it as easy as possible. And I think you'll find the last couple of features that we've implemented. We implemented something about 2 weeks ago called Meet Now, which allows you to do a video call with a patient who doesn't necessarily, as they haven't downloaded Medici as yet. They're able to access a video on a web browser. We implemented screen sharing about a week ago. So these are all functionalities that we're moving towards. I'm busy testing some stuff now. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I like keeping it as a surprise for you guys, as you know. But I mean, ease of use and data security right now is really important for us. So, and you'll see, we come up with new features all the time. So watch the space. We've got some really good stuff coming.
Dion, I see a comment from Pamela Hansford. Agrees with me that you guys tend to talk a lot. So thanks, Pamela, for your endorsement. And it's a tough. She says to try and control or pen these folk in sometimes. So
I think Pamela's siding with us, not with you, Colin. You misquoting her. She says that's what we are here for, is to talk a lot. It's not take a lot, it's talk a lot.
Yeah.
The privilege is
maybe you want to add some closing comments just before I get into next week's topic and kind of as we envisage next week to go.
Yeah.
And then we can close off for the fact that we can light the home fires and prepare for the evening. So.
Thanks, Colin. Sorry, did you say me or Neil? I see Neil's taking
yourself, Dion.
Myself.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Neil.
It's unusual for you to listen, but yeah, please, if you wouldn't mind.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Colin. From the questions that are coming up, as well as some of the chats on the side, I think it's important to recognize that there are many practices that are running that have taken some advice or just rolled into the next step. I'm so pleased to see that there are many practices that have been running for a while that are going, let me check this checklist and maybe there's areas I need to look at. I do encourage you guys to consult. We are here to assist as well, and we can direct you accordingly. So please do get hold of us. You can use info@ezmed.solutions and we'll direct your query accordingly, or direct you to somebody who can assist you. So seek the right professional advice and get that person to assist you. I think if your accountant came and said, I'm going to quickly do some physio on you, you'd be horrified. So why are we as physios trying to do a little bit of counting on the side as well? So remember, let's stick to our knitting and get the experts to help us with what we need help with. So yeah, keep building that structures, look at the practices, assess those. And I really would encourage you to challenge your accountant and say to them, I don't just want my books of accounts. Tell me what my practice is worth. What should I be looking at? And how do I actually keep growing value into this business? They need to be advising you on that. And we can continue to have a dedicated webinar on that if that's a requirement from the participants.
Gentlemen, I think judging by the comments, I think very on point today around trying to understand the value in a business, and I think part and parcel to that value and the growth of that business is understanding that the practitioners are wanting to provide a fantastic service to their patients with great outcomes. Happy patients eventually in the end, but you also want to know that you want to know that you're being paid for your services, and correctly paid and within regulation and according to stipulated rates. So we're gonna give priority to this next week. We're gonna delve into ICD-10, into the ICD overview process, give some clarity on that, maybe for insight, and then looking at using the EZMed and Medici system. We'll take you through a demo. We're going to take you through how to search, how to navigate, how to effectively select and then claim in that process. So that you know that you've got peace of mind that when you are consulting with a patient, and you're providing a fantastic service that you've studied for and you've got built up experience in, that you're fairly being compensated for that process. And that ultimately is our aim, to make sure that, that full circle is closed. So from our part, from the SpecNet Global Group, in collaboration and partnership with Medici, we are really thankful that you've joined us today, and we look forward to hosting you again on Thursday next week, as we look to progress the discussion, not through just telehealth, but effectively efficient and effective practices that are serving our communities, and also our practitioners that are being kept safe, and our practitioners that are being rewarded for their skill and for their time, and making sure that all of us come through this period strong and practices well in play, and that you've put enough foundation down for the years to come, not just when we're talking about COVID. So that's all from our side. That's all from the SpecNet Global Group. Thank you so much. From myself, Colin, we'll be signing out. Thank you so much. Enjoy your evening, and we look forward to hosting and entertaining some of your questions next week when we get on board again. Thank you so much, folks. Take care. Ciao.
Thanks, Colin.
Good night, all.
Thanks, Neil. Have a good one. Thank you, everybody.